Now!
Hey, it's just my light, man. Look, see? It's off.
Step off the bike! Do it now!
All right, hands up. I'm not touching anything.
Stay still. Keep those hands where I can see them.
There is a particular kind of silence that descends in the moments before everything changes. It is not the absence of sound, but rather a compression of it. The world narrows to a single point of contact between two human beings, and in that narrow space, the entire weight of power, authority, and constitutional rights hangs suspended like a drop of water at the edge of a leaf. In the stories you are about to hear, that drop falls. And when it does, it reveals something profound about the nature of authority, the fragility of civil liberties, and the courage it takes to stand firm when everything in you screams to simply comply. These are not stories about criminals. They are not tales of dangerous suspects or violent confrontations. These are accounts of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives who suddenly found themselves face to face with officers of the law who, for reasons that range from unclear to incomprehensible, decided to turn routine moments into constitutional crises. And in each case, something remarkable happened. The person on the receiving end of this authority did not simply bow their head. They questioned, they recorded, they remembered their rights, and in doing so, they captured on camera the exact moment when the officers realized they had made a terrible miscalculation. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when unchecked power meets informed resistance, stay with me through this entire video. What you are about to witness will challenge your assumptions about routine police encounters and perhaps change the way you think about your own rights the next time you see those flashing lights in your rearview mirror. The first story takes us to the high desert of western Nevada, to a small community called Ridgewood Springs, about 35 miles east of Reno. It was the evening of October 11th, 2023, and the autumn sun had already dipped below the Sierra Nevada range to the west, casting long purple shadows across the apartment complex on Mesquite Boulevard. The temperature had dropped to a comfortable 62 degrees, and the smell of burning juniper hung in the air from a small gathering happening in the dirt lot adjacent to the Pinecrest Apartments. Marcus Thibodeau had just left that gathering. He was 34 years old, a mechanic who worked at an auto shop about 2 miles down the road, and on this particular evening, he was making his way home on his bicycle. It was a route he had traveled hundreds of times before. The path wound through the apartment complex, past the community garden that the residents had planted the previous spring, and out onto the main road that would take him to his small house on the other side of town. In his right hand, Marcus held a detachable LED bicycle light. The light was bright white, powered by a rechargeable battery, and he had removed it from his handlebars because he was riding slowly through the apartment complex and did not need it at that moment. The road through Pinecrest was well lit by overhead lamps, and he could see perfectly well without the additional illumination. His plan was simple: reattach the light when he reached the main road, then pedal the remaining distance home. He never got the chance to execute that plan. Deputy Warren Briggs of the Pershing County Sheriff's Office had been sitting in his patrol vehicle in the parking lot of a convenience store about 200 yards from the apartment complex. He was responding to a call about the bonfire, which a neighbor had reported as a potential code violation. When he arrived, he found nothing more than a small group of adults enjoying a Thursday evening around a contained fire pit. No violations, no concerns. He had already radioed dispatch to report that the call was unfounded, but as Deputy Briggs prepared to leave, his attention was drawn to a figure on a bicycle emerging from the apartment complex. In the gathering dusk, he watched Marcus Thibodeau pedal slowly down the access road. Something about the scene caught his eye. Perhaps it was the casual pace. Perhaps it was the fact that he could not see an illuminated light on the bicycle. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something he would never articulate clearly in any report or any subsequent legal proceeding. What happened next would change both of their lives, though in very different ways. Deputy Briggs pulled his cruiser out of the convenience store lot and accelerated toward the cyclist. His overhead lights remained off. He approached from behind, drawing alongside Marcus and then cutting sharply to the right, forcing the cyclist to brake abruptly or risk collision with the patrol vehicle. The deputy's window was down and his voice carried clearly in the evening air. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as the cruiser cut him off. He squeezed his brakes and planted his feet on the ground, steadying himself as the patrol car came to a stop just a few feet ahead of him. The driver's door opened, and Deputy Briggs emerged. He was a large man, well over 6 feet tall, with a shaved head and a manner that suggested he was not accustomed to having his authority questioned. His hand rested on his duty belt as he approached. The initial exchange was brief but revealing. The deputy demanded to know why Marcus was riding without a light on his bicycle. Marcus, still straddling his bike, held up his right hand to show the detachable LED unit he was carrying. He explained that he had removed it while traveling through the well-lit apartment complex and was about to reattach it before reaching the main road. This explanation, which was both reasonable and entirely legal, did not satisfy the deputy. What followed was a rapid escalation that caught Marcus completely off guard. The deputy's voice grew louder. His questions became more pointed. He demanded identification. He demanded to know where Marcus was coming from. He demanded to know where he was going. Each answer Marcus provided seemed to increase rather than decrease the deputy's agitation. Marcus Thibodeau was not a lawyer. He had not studied constitutional law, but he was a man who paid attention to the world around him, who had seen enough videos of police encounters to know that he had certain rights, and who understood on a fundamental level that something about this interaction was deeply wrong. When the deputy demanded that he produce identification, Marcus asked a simple question. What crime was he being accused of committing? The deputy's response would later become central to the legal case that followed. Instead of articulating a clear legal violation, instead of explaining the specific statute that Marcus had allegedly broken, he said something that betrayed the arbitrary nature of the entire encounter. He told Marcus that he was being detained for not listening. Think about that phrase for a moment. Not for violating a traffic law. Not for engaging in suspicious behavior. Not for anything that remotely resembled criminal activity. For not listening. In that moment, a citizen's exercise of his constitutional rights had been reframed as an act of defiance that warranted detention. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone in a position of authority demanded your compliance without explanation? How did it feel? What did you do? Drop your experience in the comments below. And if you find these kinds of detailed breakdowns valuable, consider subscribing to this channel. We go deep on stories that matter. Back in Ridgewood Springs, the situation on Mesquite Boulevard was deteriorating rapidly. Marcus had asked to speak with a supervisor. In any normal circumstance, this would be a reasonable request. Citizens have the right to request supervisory oversight during police encounters, and officers are generally trained to accommodate such requests when feasible. But Deputy Briggs' response suggested a very different understanding of the chain of command. He informed Marcus that he was the supervisor. The way he said it, with a dismissive profanity attached, made clear that no higher authority would be coming to mediate this encounter. Marcus was alone in the gathering darkness, facing an officer who seemed to have no interest in de-escalation and no apparent limitation on his exercise of power. The deputy's body camera captured what happened next. Marcus, still standing with his bicycle, attempted to articulate his understanding of his rights. He referenced the Fourth Amendment. He mentioned the constitutional protection against unreasonable search and seizure. He asked repeatedly for the deputy to explain the specific articulable facts that justified this detention. Each question was met with increased hostility, and then the threats began. Deputy Briggs informed Marcus that if he did not comply immediately, he would deploy his taser. The weapon was already in his hand. Marcus could see the yellow housing. The twin probes at the end of the barrel pointed in his general direction. He understood in that moment that he was seconds away from 50,000 volts coursing through his body, that he could be incapacitated, injured, or worse, all because he had asked a question about the legal basis for being stopped while riding his bicycle. Marcus made a decision that many people in his situation would not have been able to make. He did not run. He did not physically resist. He did not escalate the confrontation in any way that could have been used to justify the deputy's increasingly aggressive posture. Instead, he continued to speak calmly. He continued to assert his rights. He continued to document because by this point, he had managed to activate the recording function on his phone, which was tucked into the pocket of his work jacket with the camera lens just visible at the top. The detention proceeded. Marcus was handcuffed. He was placed in the back of the patrol car. And then something happened that revealed the true nature of this encounter more clearly than anything that had come before. Deputy Briggs walked over to another officer who had arrived on the scene, a Deputy Martinez, and the two men began to converse. They did not know that Marcus's phone was still recording. They did not realize that their conversation, picked up by the ambient microphone, would later be analyzed by attorneys and submitted as evidence. The two deputies discussed the situation. Deputy Briggs expressed uncertainty about the actual legal basis for the stop. He mentioned the bicycle light, but his tone suggested doubt about whether that alone was sufficient. Deputy Martinez proposed an alternative theory. Perhaps, he suggested, the bicycle was stolen. There had been some thefts in the area recently. Maybe the bike belonged to someone else. This conversation is worth examining closely because it reveals a troubling pattern that emerges again and again in problematic police encounters. An officer makes a stop based on questionable grounds. The citizen challenges the basis for the stop. The officer, realizing that his initial justification may not withstand scrutiny, begins searching for additional reasons to support the detention. This is sometimes called, quote, zero, and it represents a fundamental inversion of how constitutional protections are supposed to work. The Fourth Amendment requires that officers have reasonable suspicion before initiating a detention and probable cause before making an arrest. These standards exist specifically to prevent the kind of arbitrary police action that characterized authoritarian regimes throughout history. When an officer detains someone first and then searches for justification afterward, he is violating not just the letter of the law, but the entire philosophical foundation upon which American civil liberties rest. In the patrol car, Marcus waited. His wrists hurt where the handcuffs bit into his skin. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. But he also felt something else, something that surprised him with its intensity. He felt certain that he had done nothing wrong, certain that his rights had been violated, certain that this was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning. The deputies eventually decided to arrest Marcus on a charge of resisting an officer. This charge, which is often used as a catch-all when officers cannot identify a specific violation, alleged that Marcus had unlawfully resisted the deputies' lawful orders. The irony was lost on no one who later reviewed the footage. What had Marcus actually done? He had asked questions. He had requested a supervisor. He had asserted his constitutional rights. In the eyes of Deputy Briggs, these acts of citizenship constituted resistance. Marcus was transported to the Pershing County Jail, where he was booked and processed. He spent the night in a holding cell, lying on a thin mattress, staring at the cinder block ceiling, replaying the encounter in his mind. He thought about all the ways it could have gone differently. He thought about what would have happened if he had simply complied, handed over his identification, answered every question without pushback. He probably would have been home within 15 minutes. He would not be facing a criminal charge. He would not be sleeping on this uncomfortable bed. But he also knew something else. He knew that compliance would not have made the encounter right. It would only have made it easier. The deputy's behavior, his lack of clear justification, his threats, his dismissive attitude toward constitutional protections, none of that would have been captured on record. None of it would have been challenged. The next person Deputy Briggs stopped might not have been as fortunate, might not have had a phone, might not have known their rights, might have escalated the situation in fear and ended up injured or dead. By standing firm, by insisting on accountability, Marcus had created a record, and that record would become a weapon in its own right. In the weeks that followed, the case against Marcus Thibodeau became a subject of intense interest in Ridgewood Springs and beyond. The video he had captured, along with the deputy's body camera footage, which was obtained through a public records request, circulated widely on social media. Legal experts analyzed every moment. Civil rights organizations expressed concern. Local news outlets ran stories questioning the sheriff's office's training and supervision practices. The identity of Deputy Briggs was initially kept confidential by the department, a decision that itself drew criticism from transparency advocates. But the facts of the encounter were undeniable. They were preserved in high-definition video, complete with audio. Every threat, every dismissive comment, every moment of uncertainty as the deputy struggled to articulate a clear legal basis for his actions. As of the most recent available information, the charge of resisting an officer against Marcus Thibodeau remains pending. His attorney has filed motions to dismiss based on the lack of reasonable suspicion for the initial stop. The outcome of those motions will likely determine whether Marcus faces trial or whether the entire case collapses under the weight of its own constitutional infirmity. But regardless of how the legal proceedings conclude, something important has already happened. A moment of authority being exercised without justification has been documented. A citizen's refusal to simply accept that authority has been recorded for posterity, and a conversation that might otherwise have remained invisible, in which two deputies discussed finding reasons to justify a detention that had already occurred, has been exposed to public scrutiny. Let us move now to our second story, which takes us from the desert of Nevada to the humid lowlands of southeastern Florida. The community of Wellington Shores sits about 45 miles north of Miami, in a region where suburban developments give way to agricultural land, and the Everglades begin their slow spread toward the Gulf of Mexico. It is a place where life moves at a different pace, where pickup trucks outnumber sedans, and where the long, straight roads that connect scattered communities invite drivers to relax into the emptiness. Derek Callahan was driving one of those roads on the morning of March 17th, 2022. He was behind the wheel of a work truck, a white Ford F-150 with the logo of his employer, a regional HVAC company, emblazoned on the doors. The truck was well-maintained, properly registered, and equipped with all required safety features. Derek himself was a model employee, 8 years with the company, not a single moving violation on his record. The road he was traveling, a stretch of County Road 89 that ran parallel to a drainage canal, had a posted speed limit of 60 miles per hour. Derek was monitoring his speed carefully, as he always did when driving a company vehicle. The speedometer read 57 miles per hour. He was actually 3 miles under the limit, a fact that would become central to everything that followed. In his rearview mirror, Derek noticed a Palm Beach County Sheriff's cruiser approaching from behind. The cruiser was moving fast, faster than the traffic around it, and Derek felt the instinctive flutter of anxiety that most drivers experience when a patrol car appears in their vicinity. He checked his speedometer again. Still 57. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His seatbelt was fastened. He was doing everything right. The cruiser pulled alongside him. Derek glanced over and made brief eye contact with the deputy behind the wheel. Then, unexpectedly, the deputy gestured for him to pull over. Derek's confusion deepened. He had not been speeding. His turn signals were functioning. His brake lights worked. He had no idea what possible violation could have prompted this stop. He pulled the F-150 onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires as he brought the vehicle to a stop. In his mirror, he watched the deputy exit the cruiser and approach. The deputy's name, as Derek would later learn, was Officer Renfrow. He was a relatively young man, perhaps early 30s, with a demeanor that suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. The initial exchange was bewildering. Officer Renfrow informed Derek that he had been pulled over because he was driving below the speed limit. Derek asked for clarification. Yes, the deputy confirmed, driving below the speed limit. Derek pointed out that the limit was 60 and he had been traveling at 57. How was driving 3 miles per hour under the limit a violation of anything? The deputy's response was remarkable in its circularity. He maintained that driving under the speed limit was illegal. He could not cite a specific statute. He could not explain the legal principle he was invoking. He simply repeated the assertion as if saying it with sufficient confidence would make it true. Derek Callahan was not a lawyer, but he was a man who had been driving for over 20 years, who had taken driver's education courses, who had studied the rules of the road, and he knew with absolute certainty that what the deputy was telling him was wrong. Driving below the speed limit, in the absence of other factors like impeding traffic flow, is not a traffic violation. The speed limit is a maximum, not a minimum. Every driver in America knows this. Apparently, Officer Renfrow did not. What would you do in this situation? You are sitting in your vehicle, being told by a uniformed officer of the law that you have committed a violation that you know does not exist. Do you argue? Do you comply? Do you simply hope the encounter ends quickly so you can get on with your day? This is the impossible calculus that citizens face in these moments, and it is a calculus that the Constitution was supposed to make unnecessary. Derek decided to seek accountability. He asked the deputy for his name and badge number. This is a request that citizens have every right to make, and officers have an obligation to provide this information. It is a basic principle of police accountability. Citizens need to be able to identify the officers who interact with them so that, if necessary, they can file complaints, seek redress, or simply have a record of what occurred. Officer Renfrau's response was stunning. He refused to provide his name. He refused to provide his badge number. And then, before Derek could say another word, the deputy turned on his heel, walked back to his cruiser, got in, and drove away. Derek sat in his truck on the shoulder of County Road 89, trying to process what had just happened. He had been pulled over for a non-existent violation. When he asked for identification from the officer had simply fled the scene. It was as if the normal rules governing police conduct had been suspended entirely. But Derek was not finished. He put his truck back in gear and pulled onto the road, accelerating to catch up with the cruiser. As he drew closer, he could see the license plate on the back of the patrol car. He grabbed his phone and captured a photo. The plate read ZRKM 14PBSO. He had his record. In the following days, Derek prepared to file a formal complaint with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. He had the photograph of the license plate. He had his own account of what had happened. He was ready to navigate whatever bureaucratic process was necessary to ensure that Officer Renfrau was held accountable for his bizarre conduct. But then something happened that transformed this encounter from a strange traffic stop into something far more troubling. Before Derek could file his complaint, he received a call from his supervisor at the HVAC company. The supervisor sounded uncomfortable, uncertain. He explained that the company had received a formal complaint from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. The complaint alleged that one of their employees driving a company vehicle had behaved in a rude and inappropriate manner during a traffic stop. The complaint recommended that the employee face disciplinary action. Derek felt the blood drain from his face. He understood immediately what had happened. Officer Renfrau, realizing that he had made a significant error, had decided to go on the offensive. By filing a preemptive complaint against Derek, he had created a situation where Derek's own complaint would appear retaliatory. Even worse, the complaint threatened Derek's livelihood. If his employer believed the deputy's account, Derek could face termination. This tactic, using official channels to retaliate against citizens who attempt to assert their rights, is not new. It has been documented in police encounters across the country. But experiencing it firsthand gave Derek a visceral understanding of how effective it can be. Suddenly, his priorities shifted. Instead of pursuing accountability for the officer, he found himself scrambling to defend his own employment, to explain to his supervisor that the deputy's account was false, to hope that his 8 years of exemplary service would be enough to protect him. The complaint against Derek was eventually dismissed by his employer, who trusted his account over the deputy's. But the damage had been done. Derek never filed his complaint with the sheriff's office. The risk was simply too great. Officer Renfrau continues to patrol the roads of Palm Beach County, and the illegal stop that occurred on County Road 89 remains, officially, as if it never happened. This outcome deserves reflection. Here was a citizen who did everything right. He was driving legally. He was polite during the encounter. He attempted to use proper channels to seek accountability. And yet, through a combination of official retaliation and personal vulnerability, he was forced to abandon his pursuit of justice. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, not to protect citizens from abuse, but to insulate officers from consequences. If you have ever faced this kind of pressure, this impossible choice between your rights and your livelihood, share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter. They form the collective record of how power operates in America, and they remind all of us that the Constitution, however beautifully written, means nothing if it cannot be enforced. Our third story carries us westward to the sun-soaked streets of Southern California. The city of Newport Vista sits in the shadow of the San Gabriel Mountains, a suburban community of about 125,000 people where the palm trees sway in the Pacific breeze and the rumble of expensive automobiles is a familiar sound. This is a place where wealth is displayed openly, where the local economy depends in part on attracting tourists and enthusiasts who come to see the exotic cars that prowl these streets. Brandon LeClaire was one of those enthusiasts. At 28 years old, he had built a successful business as a social media entrepreneur, creating content about luxury vehicles and the lifestyle that surrounds them. His YouTube channel had accumulated several 100,000 subscribers who tuned in to watch him review high-end sports cars, attend automotive events, and occasionally showcase the vehicles he had access to through his work. On the afternoon of February 4th, 2024, Brandon was driving through Newport Vista in a vehicle that turned heads wherever it went. It was a Lamborghini Gallardo, finished in a deep metallic blue that seemed to shift colors in the California sunlight. The car was not his personal property. It was owned by a corporation registered in British Columbia, Canada, and Brandon had been given permission to use it for content creation purposes. The Gallardo announced its presence long before it came into view. The V10 engine produced a distinctive wail, a mechanical symphony that rose and fell with the application of the throttle. It was not a quiet car by any standard. Italian supercars are not designed for discretion. They are designed to be seen and heard, to make a statement about engineering excellence and the pursuit of automotive perfection. Officer Dominguez of the Newport Vista Police Department was parked in a lot adjacent to Pacific Coast Boulevard when the Gallardo passed by. He heard it before he saw it. The exhaust note was unmistakable, rising above the ambient sound of traffic like a tenor breaking free from a choir. His attention sharpened. His hand moved toward the ignition. The stop itself was unremarkable, at least initially. Officer Dominguez activated his lights and pulled Brandon over to the curb. The Gallardo came to rest in front of a boutique clothing store, its engine settling into an impatient idle as the driver waited for the officer to approach. Officer Dominguez explained the reason for the stop. Loud exhaust. The noise from the vehicle, he said, exceeded what was permissible under local ordinances. Brandon nodded. He understood that the Gallardo was not exactly subtle. He was prepared to accept a citation for the exhaust if that was the outcome. But then the encounter took an unexpected turn. The officer asked for registration documents. Brandon provided them. The documentation showed that the vehicle was registered in the Canadian province of British Columbia. The registered owner was a numbered corporation, a common business structure in Canada. The address was in Vancouver. Officer Dominguez returned to his patrol car to run the documents through his computer system. Several minutes passed. Brandon sat in the Gallardo, watching in his side mirror as the officer typed on his laptop, made phone calls, and appeared increasingly frustrated. Something was not working. The system was not accepting the Canadian address. The officer could not complete whatever process he was attempting to initiate. When Officer Dominguez returned to the Lamborghini, his demeanor had shifted. There was an edge to his voice that had not been there before. He informed Brandon that he was going to issue a citation. Brandon asked what the citation was for. The exhaust, the officer replied. Brandon acknowledged this and asked if the officer could explain the citation before he signed it. This request, reasonable by any standard, seemed to provoke an outsized reaction. Officer Dominguez became evasive. He handed Brandon the citation and told him to sign it. Brandon, looking at the document, noticed something that had not been mentioned during their conversation. In addition to the exhaust violation, there was a notation about quote 1. The officer was apparently claiming that Brandon had been speeding. Based solely on the officer's visual observation, this was the first Brandon had heard of any speeding allegation. He asked about it. He pointed to the notation and asked the officer to explain when and where this alleged speeding had occurred. Officer Dominguez's response was to walk away. He literally turned his back on Brandon and began walking toward his patrol car. Brandon called after him. He was still holding the unsigned citation. He asked again for an explanation. The officer kept walking. Then, without turning around, he said something that revealed the arbitrary nature of the entire encounter. He told Brandon that by asking questions, Brandon was delaying his duties. He suggested that if Brandon did not sign the citation immediately, there could be additional consequences. Think about the implication of that statement. A citizen asks a law enforcement officer to explain a citation before signing it. The officer characterizes this request as an obstruction of his work and implies that further consequences could follow. In what conception of justice does asking questions constitute a punishable offense? By this point, a second officer had arrived on the scene. This officer, whose name was later identified as Sergeant Chen, approached the Lamborghini with a different demeanor. He was calmer, more measured. He mentioned something about the vehicle's headlights, suggesting that there was condensation visible inside the lens assemblies. This observation, which had nothing to do with the original stop for loud exhaust, seemed to be another attempt to find additional violations to support the encounter. Brandon found himself in a frustrating position. He had been stopped for a legitimate reason, the exhaust, and was prepared to accept that consequence. But the stop had morphed into something else entirely. A speeding allegation had appeared from nowhere. His questions were being treated as obstruction. Additional violations were being invented on the spot. The encounter had stopped being about enforcing traffic laws and had become about something else, about authority, about control, about the officer's irritation at being questioned. The interaction between Canadian vehicle registration and United States traffic enforcement is actually an interesting legal question. Vehicles registered in Canada are permitted to operate in the United States under the terms of various treaties and agreements between the two countries. There are specific provisions that address how citations and violations should be handled when they involve foreign registered vehicles. Whether those provisions would have exempted Brandon from the citations is unclear. What is clear is that Officer Dominguez made no mention of any such considerations. He simply proceeded as if the Canadian registration was an inconvenience to his paperwork, rather than a potentially relevant legal factor. Brandon eventually signed the citation under protest. He noted the officer's name and badge number. He resolved to file a formal complaint with the Newport Vista Police Department, which he did in the following weeks. The outcome of that complaint is not publicly known as of the most recent available information, but the encounter itself, captured on Brandon's recording equipment, which he routinely used for his content creation, became part of the larger documentation of problematic police stops. It joined the archive of incidents where officers seemed more interested in asserting authority than in fairly enforcing the law. It added another data point to the growing body of evidence that suggests something is fundamentally broken in the way routine traffic enforcement is conducted in America. What would you have done in Brandon's position? Would you have signed the citation without question? Would you have refused and risked arrest? Would you have asked for a supervisor, knowing how such requests often end? There are no easy answers to these questions. And the fact that they even need to be asked tells us something important about the state of police-citizen relations in this country. If you are finding these stories as compelling as I find them troubling, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We are committed to telling these stories in full, without sensationalism, without shortcuts. The truth deserves time and attention. Our fourth and final story takes us to the remote reaches of southern Utah, to a place where the Red Rock Canyons give way to high desert plateaus and the stars at night seem close enough to touch. Millard County is one of the least populated regions in the continental United States. Its small towns are separated by vast distances, connected by roads that stretch across the landscape like ribbons of asphalt laid down by some giant hand. The town of Garrison sits at the intersection of two such roads, a community of perhaps 500 people who know each other by name and conduct their business in the unhurried manner of people who are not going anywhere in particular. Once a year, Garrison hosts its Heritage Days celebration, a weekend of festivities that commemorates the founding of the town and the pioneers who settled this challenging land. On August 5th, 2022, Heritage Days was in full swing. The main street was lined with vendor booths. Local civic organizations had set up displays. Children ran between the legs of adults, clutching cotton candy and trying to win prizes at the carnival games. The smell of grilled meat and funnel cakes hung in the air. It was, by all accounts, a typical small-town celebration. Into this scene came three activists from an animal rights organization called Coalition for Agricultural Ethics. Their names were Rebecca Walters, Miguel Santos, and Curtis Hendricks. They had driven nearly 4 hours from Salt Lake City to attend the celebration. Their purpose was to distribute informational flyers about a trial that was scheduled to begin the following month. The trial involved a large-scale agricultural operation called Meridian Farms, one of the biggest employers in Millard County. Meridian had been accused of animal cruelty violations at one of its facilities, and the upcoming trial had generated significant attention from animal welfare advocates across the region. The flyers that Rebecca, Miguel, and Curtis intended to distribute contained information about the trial, the allegations against Meridian, and how interested citizens could follow the proceedings. This was classic First Amendment activity. The distribution of informational materials on public property is one of the most protected forms of speech under the Constitution. The sidewalks of Garrison's Main Street, like sidewalks throughout America, are designated public forums where citizens have the right to engage with others, share information, and advocate for causes they believe in. No permit is required for such activity. No prior approval is necessary. This right has been affirmed by the Supreme Court in numerous decisions spanning more than a century. Rebecca, Miguel, and Curtis began their work. They stationed themselves at different points along the main street, approaching festival goers with friendly smiles and offering flyers to anyone who seemed interested. Many people declined, which was their right. Some people accepted the materials, glanced at them, and tucked them into pockets or purses. A few engaged the activists in conversation, asking questions about the trial and the allegations against Meridian. It was, in other words, democracy in action. Citizens exercising their rights, other citizens choosing whether or not to engage, the marketplace of ideas functioning as the founders intended. But not everyone saw it that way. Within 30 minutes of the activists' arrival, a deputy from the Millard County Sheriff's Office approached Miguel. The deputy's name was Officer Harrison. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, with a ruddy complexion and the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His first words to Miguel set the tone for everything that followed. Officer Harrison told Miguel that he needed to leave. When Miguel asked why, the deputy explained that distributing materials at the festival was not permitted. When Miguel pointed out that he was on a public sidewalk and exercising his First Amendment rights, the deputy's response was dismissive. He said that Miguel would need to obtain a permit from the city if he wanted to talk to people. This statement was false. There is no legal requirement to obtain a permit for the distribution of informational materials on public sidewalks. Such a requirement, if it existed, would be a prior restraint on speech, exactly the kind of government overreach that the First Amendment was designed to prevent. The Supreme Court has been crystal clear on this point. The government cannot require citizens to seek permission before engaging in protected speech in traditional public forums. But Miguel was not in a position to argue constitutional law with a sheriff's deputy on a crowded street in rural Utah. He attempted to explain his understanding of the law. The deputy was uninterested. The conversation grew more tense. By this point, Rebecca and Curtis had noticed the interaction and moved to join their colleague. Their arrival seemed to increase the deputy's agitation. He radioed for backup. Within minutes, 2 additional deputies arrived on the scene, including a senior officer named Sergeant Powell. What happened next would become the subject of a federal civil rights lawsuit filed less than 2 weeks later. Sergeant Powell took charge of the situation. He was even more aggressive than Officer Harrison had been. He told the activists that they were disrupting the festival. He told them that their presence was making people uncomfortable. He told them that they needed to leave immediately or face arrest. Curtis Hendricks, who had experience documenting police encounters, was recording the interaction on his phone. When Sergeant Powell noticed this, he made a remarkable statement. He told Curtis that filming a police officer without consent was illegal. This assertion, like the earlier claim about permits, was completely false. The right to film police officers performing their duties in public spaces has been affirmed by federal courts across the country. It is considered a clearly established right under the First Amendment. The activists tried to explain this. They cited their rights. They attempted to de-escalate the situation by speaking calmly and non-confrontationally. But the deputies seemed uninterested in legal arguments. Their goal, it became clear, was to remove the activists from the festival by any means necessary. And then Sergeant Powell made a decision that would reveal his true motivations more clearly than anything else he had said or done. He turned to the crowd of festival goers who had gathered to watch the confrontation and made an announcement. He pointed at the 3 activists and declared, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that these were the people who were trying to shut down Meridian Farms. The effect of this statement was immediate and dramatic. The crowd's demeanor shifted. Where there had been curiosity and perhaps sympathy for the activists, there was now hostility. Meridian Farms was a major employer in the region. Many of the people at the Heritage Days Festival worked for the company or had family members who did. By framing the activists as a threat to local livelihoods, Sergeant Powell had transformed the encounter from a police matter into a community confrontation. People began shouting at the activists. Some demanded that they leave. Others made threatening gestures. The atmosphere, which had been merely tense, became genuinely dangerous. Rebecca, Miguel, and Curtis found themselves surrounded by an angry crowd, with sheriff's deputies who seemed more interested in stoking the confrontation than in maintaining order. Eventually, Curtis Hendricks was issued a citation for disorderly conduct. The specific basis for this charge was never clearly articulated. He had not raised his voice. He had not made any physical movements that could be construed as threatening. He had simply stood on a public sidewalk, distributed informational flyers, and recorded police officers performing their duties. In the eyes of Sergeant Powell, apparently, this constituted disorderly conduct. The activists left the festival. They had no choice. The combination of official intimidation and crowd hostility made remaining impossible. They drove back to Salt Lake City. Shaken and angry, but also determined. They had the video. They had documentation of every false statement the deputies had made. They had evidence of a systematic attempt to suppress their constitutionally protected speech. On August 19, 2022, just 2 weeks after the incident, Curtis Hendricks and the Coalition for Agricultural Ethics filed a federal lawsuit against Sergeant Powell, Officer Harrison, and Millard County. The lawsuit alleged violations of the First Amendment, specifically the right to free speech, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, and the right to record public officials in the performance of their duties. The lawsuit also raised concerns about the role of local law enforcement in protecting the interests of powerful agricultural corporations. The timing of the incident, coming just weeks before a trial in which Meridian Farms faced serious allegations, suggested that the deputies may have been motivated by something other than public safety concerns. The lawsuit argued that the deputies had used their official authority to silence critics of a local employer, effectively acting as private security rather than neutral enforcers of the law. As of the most recent available information, the federal lawsuit is ongoing. The proceedings have been complicated by various procedural issues, and the ultimate outcome remains uncertain. But the case has already achieved something important. It has created a public record of what happened on that August afternoon in Garrison, Utah. It has documented the false statements made by deputies. It has preserved the evidence of constitutional violations. Whatever happens in the courtroom, the truth of what occurred cannot be hidden or forgotten. These 4 stories, from the desert of Nevada to the wetlands of Florida, from the streets of Southern California to the canyons of Utah, might seem disconnected. Different places, different circumstances, different people. But if you look closely, you can see the threads that bind them together. In each case, a citizen encountered a law enforcement officer who was either unable or unwilling to articulate a legitimate legal basis for their actions. In each case, the citizen attempted to assert their constitutional rights. And in each case, the officer responded not with explanation or de-escalation, but with threats, retaliation, or escalation. Marcus Thibodeau asked what crime he was being accused of committing. He was told he was being detained for not listening. Derek Callahan asked for the officer's name and badge number. The officer fled the scene and filed a retaliatory complaint. Brandon LeClaire asked for an explanation of the charges against him. He was told that his questions were delaying the officer's duties. Curtis Hendricks recorded public officials performing their duties in public. He was told that filming without consent was illegal and was cited for disorderly conduct. Each of these responses represents a failure. A failure of training, certainly. A failure of supervision, undoubtedly. But more fundamentally, a failure of the basic compact between citizens and the state. The Constitution grants law enforcement officers significant power. They can detain people. They can search people. They can use force, including lethal force, under certain circumstances. But this power comes with constraints. It comes with obligations. It comes with the requirement that officers be able to articulate legitimate, lawful reasons for their actions. When officers cannot or will not meet this requirement, when they respond to questions with hostility and demands for compliance with threats, they undermine the legitimacy of law enforcement itself. They transform encounters that should be governed by law into encounters that are governed by nothing more than the relative power of the parties involved. And in those encounters, the citizen is always at a disadvantage. This is not a problem that affects only the people in these stories. It is a problem that affects every person in America who might, at any moment, find themselves on the side of a road with flashing lights in their mirror. It is a problem that affects every community where trust between police and citizens has been eroded by encounters like these. It is a problem that affects the officers themselves, the vast majority of whom joined law enforcement to protect and serve, not to intimidate and suppress. What can be done? The answer begins with documentation. Every encounter captured on camera, every instance of overreach preserved for the record, every lawsuit filed in defense of constitutional rights. These are the building blocks of accountability. They are the evidence that makes reform possible. They are the proof that separates allegations from facts. Marcus Thibodeau captured his encounter on a phone tucked into his jacket pocket. Derek Callahan photographed the license plate of the cruiser that drove away from him. Brandon LeClaire recorded his interaction as part of his routine content creation. Curtis Hendricks was filming when the deputies made their false statements about the law. In each case, the documentation transformed what might have been a forgotten incident into a matter of public record. But documentation alone is not enough. It must be accompanied by the willingness to pursue accountability through official channels, even when those channels are imperfect, even when retaliation is possible, even when the outcome is uncertain. Derek Callahan's experience shows how difficult this can be. The threat to his employment forced him to abandon his complaint. But the fact that such tactics exist and work is itself an argument for systemic reform. Citizens should not have to choose between their rights and their livelihoods. The legal system also has a role to play. The federal lawsuit filed by Curtis Hendricks and the Coalition for Agricultural Ethics represents an attempt to hold officers accountable through the courts. Such lawsuits are expensive, time-consuming, and often unsuccessful due to legal doctrines that provide officers with broad immunity from civil liability. But when they succeed, they create precedents that constrain future conduct. They establish that certain actions have consequences. They remind officers and departments that the Constitution is not merely advisory. And then there is the court of public opinion. Stories like these, told in full detail, shared widely, discussed openly, shape the broader conversation about policing in America. They make visible what often remains hidden. They give voice to people who might otherwise be dismissed or ignored. They create pressure for reform that can influence policy, training, and culture in ways that official channels alone cannot achieve. I want to end with a question for you, the viewer. What would you do if you found yourself in one of these situations? If a deputy pulled you over and demanded compliance without explanation, if an officer refused to identify himself and then filed a complaint against you, if you were told that exercising your constitutional rights constituted a crime, there is no universal answer to these questions. Every situation is different. Every person's risk tolerance is different. Every community's relationship with law enforcement is different. But what I hope these stories make clear is that the choice is not simply between compliance and confrontation. There is a middle path, the path of informed assertion of rights, of documentation, of persistent pursuit of accountability. It is not an easy path. It carries risks. But it is the path that Marcus Thibodeau, Derek Callahan, Brandon LeClaire, and Curtis Hendricks chose to walk. And by walking it, they illuminated something important about the world we live in. The badge is a symbol. It represents the authority of the state, the power to enforce laws, the responsibility to protect citizens from harm. But a symbol is only as meaningful as the reality it represents. When officers abuse their authority, when they make arbitrary demands, when they threaten and retaliate and lie, they diminish not only themselves but the badge they wear. They transform a symbol of protection into a symbol of oppression. And they make it harder for the officers who do their jobs honestly and honorably to earn the trust that effective policing requires. These 4 incidents, spread across thousands of miles and many months, might seem like isolated cases. But the patterns they reveal are anything but isolated. They are symptoms of deeper problems in how police are trained, supervised, and held accountable. They are reflections of a system that too often protects officers from consequences rather than protecting citizens from abuse. And they are reminders that the rights guaranteed by the Constitution are only as strong as our willingness to defend them. If you believe that these stories matter, if you think that accountability is important, if you want to see more in-depth examinations of how power operates in America, Then do something simple but meaningful. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Leave a comment with your own thoughts and experiences. Become part of the community of people who believe that the truth deserves attention and that justice requires effort. The story of policing in America is still being written. It is being written in courtrooms and city council chambers. It is being written in policy debates and training academies. But it is also being written on the streets, in the moments when ordinary people encounter officers and make choices about how to respond. Marcus, Derek, Brandon, and Curtis each made their choices. Their stories have become part of the record. The question is, what will the next chapter say? The Constitution promises that citizens will be secure in their persons against unreasonable searches and seizures. It promises that no one will be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It promises that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the right of the people to petition the government for redress of grievances. These promises are not automatic. They do not enforce themselves. They require vigilance. They require courage. They require the willingness to stand firm even when every instinct screams to simply comply. In a perfect world, that vigilance would not be necessary. In a perfect world, every officer would know and respect the constitutional limits on their authority. In a perfect world, asking questions would be welcomed rather than punished. In a perfect world, the badge would always be a symbol of protection rather than a weapon of control. We do not live in a perfect world. We live in this one. And in this world, the stories of people like Marcus Thibodeau, Derek Callahan, Brandon LeClaire, and Curtis Hendricks matter. They matter because they show us what happens when power is exercised without accountability. They matter because they demonstrate the courage it takes to stand up for one's rights. And they matter because they remind us that the arc of justice does not bend toward itself. It bends because people push it. It bends because stories are told. It bends because citizens refuse to accept the unacceptable. These are the moments when the badge becomes a weapon. These are the moments when authority is exercised without justification. And these are the moments when ordinary people, armed with nothing but their knowledge of the Constitution and their determination to see justice done, push back against the abuse of power and document the truth for all to see. The question is not whether such moments will continue to occur. They will. The question is whether we will see them, whether we will document them, whether we will tell the stories in full, whether we will demand accountability when officers fail to meet the standards their badges represent. That question has no final answer. It must be answered again and again, in every encounter, in every community, in every generation. It is the ongoing work of democracy. It is the price of liberty. And it is a price that Marcus, Derek, Brandon, and Curtis proved themselves willing to pay. What about you?